My talk today is called The Colonisation of Intimate Life. It's about the mainstreaming of sexualized violence and hazard. So this is a quote from the song Brilliant Disguise by Bruce Springsteen, and it sort of covers quite well the idea about choice and how you often end up performing in order to survive. It says, so tell me what I see when I look in your eyes. Is that you, baby, or just a brilliant disguise? So in 2019, the Hayward Gallery staged a remarkable exhibition by the French artist Kader Attia called The Museum of Emotion, which explored post-colonialism and racialized oppression. It included a short film in which the artist noted how African slaves on ships bound for the Caribbean and the Americas found favor by performing dances and songs for their abductors and owners, and how the legacy of this continues to this day, with entertainment and sport being amongst the few avenues through which African and Afro-Caribbean people are permitted to advance in Western society. For many centuries, the only trade Jews in Europe were permitted to engage in was moneylending, as it was a sin of usury for Christians. Having financed the building of York Minster, Lincoln Cathedral, and other buildings as the direct subjects of the king, dependent on royal whim for protection from attacks, Jews were expelled from it by Edward I in 1290 and had what few assets they still had seized, following similar measures by other European rulers who had no further use for them. As Ferdinand the Duck points out in the film Babe, about the pig sheep, released in 1995, he crows, as roosters are said to, every morning, to wake people so that he will be considered useful and be spared from being eaten. The roles women have performed in society have been dictated by similar mechanisms of oppression, supported by legal systems, the enforcement of social and religious norms by state and non-state actors, and by the use of actual and threatened sexual and physical violence carried out with impunity. The global onslaught of online sexualized violence, competing for clicks with acts of destruction, torture, and murder, its enactment against prostituted women and men, and its mainstreaming as part of a bucket list of steps in some sexual apprenticeship dictated by untouchable global corporations, has severe consequences for both women and men. It constitutes the colonization of intimate life. Porn and prostitution require both women and men to perform what are often violent and hazardous sexual acts in order to survive. Online porn, competing for clicks as it does with online images of extreme violence, torture, and destruction, increasingly depicts acts of extreme violence and sadism. These acts are not received as man bites dog records of outlying exceptional acts, but as part of a rote-learned sexual curriculum. Expressions of fear and distress on the faces of porn performers are deliberately induced. The cruelty is the point. It associates sex as something painful for women in the eyes of the viewer. Injuries and harm inflicted on women during porn shoots are edited out. The performers are often required to sign agreements consenting to what happened during the shoot and stating that they were not harmed after the shoot has ended and before they are paid. Like Hollywood actresses giving evidence against Harvey Weinstein and others, they will struggle to find employment in the porn industry if they make complaints or are seen as difficult or non-compliant. The media and the sex industry glamorize porn by describing performers as porn stars, regardless of the number of films in which they have appeared. Prostituted young girls and women are guinea pigs on whom men try out acts they have seen in porn, which were shot using positions chosen for the purposes of camera angles rather than because they increase sexual pleasure. This contributes to their dehumanization. I refer you to the controversy recently about comments from a group of French scientists suggesting that prostituted women in Africa would be a useful population in which to test a vaccine for COVID-19. The online depictions of sexualized violence create expectations in viewers which greatly underestimate the risk of pain, serious harm, or even death the acts depicted can carry if emulated in real life. In 60 court cases involving the deaths of UK women, the perpetrator claimed their injuries were an accident resulting from a consensual sex game gone wrong. 2/3 of these women were killed by strangulation. 48% of women using domestic abuse services provided by Refuge said they had been strangled, choked, or suffocated by their abusers. 38% of UK women under 40 reported having been non-consensually choked, slapped, gagged, or spat on by sexual partners during otherwise consensual sex. In 115 cases where women had survived severe injury during what was claimed to be consensual sexual violence, they insisted in court that they did not consent in spite of claims made by the defence. And many young women who contacted the We Can't Consent to This campaign said they felt pressured to go along with rough sex, including strangulation, for fear of being labelled prudish. I should add that strangulation is right at the top of risk levels in domestic violence if you are assessing the risk that somebody was at of imminent severe harm. If someone is seriously injured or killed in England and Wales as a result of an act of sexualised violence, the prosecution has to prove beyond reasonable doubt both that the accused person caused the injury or death and that they had the necessary level of intent at the time of the act which caused it. Two cases decided in 1999 and 2003 confirmed that where murder is concerned, the necessary level of intent is subjective. So it relates to what the accused person themselves thought the consequences of their actions would be, not whether that thought was reasonable by any other measure. The foreseeability of serious injury or death is no more than evidence from which a jury may infer intent. Where a person's view of sex is governed by online porn, the barriers to prosecution, never mind conviction, seem to be considerable. In the world of porn, injuries are edited out to minimize the level and risk of harm, trauma to the body and the mind of the recipient, and these are all deliberately minimized. In videos depicting choking, strangulation, or suffocation, for example, there are no "don't try this at home" warnings. Where videos are made in a studio, there are witnesses present. The performer subjected to these edited violent acts has some commodity value, particularly if they have an established brand, time-limited though that is. There is no comparison with the possible consequences of carrying out these acts in a state of high arousal in private. Since the late 1990s, enhanced sentences have been available for crimes aggravated by hatred towards people on a number of different grounds. These grounds now include race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and transgender identity. Hate is not specifically defined, and the Crown Prosecution Service uses a general definition which includes hostility. The grounds do not match the protected characteristics set out in the Equality Act 2010, and hatred towards someone on the grounds of their sex is not one of them. The Law Commission has been conducting a wide-ranging review of the adequacy of current hate crime laws in England and Wales. It noted that the omission of misogyny from the hate crime grounds was a particular matter of concern. It's aiming to conduct a formal consultation later this year. There's also an amendment to the domestic abuse bill currently before Parliament about making misogyny a type of hate crime. Young people interviewed as part of a study published in the British Medical Journal in 2014 provided a number of explanations for what the researchers found was a culture around heterosexual anal sex involving pain, risk, and coercion, particularly for women. The young people thought that pornography, competition between men, the claim that people must like it if they do it, made alongside the expectation that it will be painful for women. The normalization of coercion and accidental penetration, and men being expected to persuade or coerce reluctant partners. Viewers in porn and clients of prostituted women frequently fail to appreciate that both porn performers and prostituted women are performing acts and roles for a financial reward. They falsely assume that women in prostitution are more highly sexed than women outside the sex industry. This false assumption means that women who have left the industry and have relationships with men who pay for sex often find that the men expect them to perform in their intimate lives in the same way as they previously did for financial reward. This enables men who pay for sex to ignore the circumstances in which many women became involved in porn or prostitution, and promotes the belief that the women they pay perform acts as a result of a choice determined by their libido. I had an interesting comparison with this a few months ago, and I went to a grime gig where there was somebody who was instantly recognized. I was standing in a queue for coats, and he was instantly recognized because he plays a villain in a very popular YouTube series. And immediately all these people were rushing around asking him to speak in the way that he does in this particular series. And he became really frightened and moved away. And I was looking him up later on and discovered that he had spoken frequently about how, because of this role and the fact that he's very well known, If he walks out of his house, he has people coming up to him and people going past in their cars, honking horns at him, assuming that he really is this gangster who is he's portrayed as in the film. This is the same type of inability to work out that somebody is performing a role. People who are famous musicians and actors also have a difficulty with people expecting them to be what they are like on stage in private. There are similar sort of views around people who are strippers and glamour models. A couple of years before I became involved in prostitution, I actually met somebody on a train who was coming back from an event. She was a very glamorous woman, but I realized that she was a bit drunk, and so I asked her whether she wanted to share a taxi. And she then subsequently came round to my house quite a few times. And she was a senior dancer at Spearmint Rhino, and she was very intent and convinced that this was going to enable her to marry somebody who was very well off, who lived in where I did. And what interested me was that whenever she came around my house, she wore the most casual clothes. She never wore makeup, and what she really wanted to do was to be on a farm. She was then recruited from there to work for a boxing promoter, being one of the people who carries the signs for the rounds in between times. And then she used to call me at random hours, very late at night or in the early morning, completely out of her head, feeling broken and bruised and not knowing what had happened to her. That's how glamorous being a stripper at Spearmint Rhino is. And also the person who first introduced me to the website I worked from when I worked in prostitution was quite a well-known glamour model. And it was a big surprise to me to discover that, in fact, this was not how she made her money, even though she was relatively well known. It was actually through prostitution. All of these things are connected with the commodification of sex and the perpetration of violence against women also. It's a very important issue around boundaries. It's common for men who pay for sex to see themselves as having a friendship or connection with a prostituted woman they see regularly. This misconception ignores the power dynamics within a financially rewarded sexual encounter and the fact that the woman is performing a role. It's a red flag. It's often accompanied by attempts to manipulate the woman into accepting a reduced fee for the sake of friendship. In psychotherapy and counseling, there are professional boundaries observed and acknowledged between a therapist and a client. Prostitution is not a form of therapy. There is no supervision for women involved in it who are more likely to encounter social workers. Repeating or escalating acts of sexualized violence against women is not personal growth. Kink as therapy carries a very high risk of exploitation. I had a client when I was involved in prostitution who contacted me because he was 18 years old and he was about to have an arranged marriage. And he had had no sexual experience and was very concerned about not being able to perform for his wife. So I started speaking to him, and I noticed that several times he said to me, "Oh, but it's haram, isn't it, about paying me for sex?" Haram is the Arabic word and the word in the Quran for evil. So I then said to him that, yes, it is. And I said, why would you think that you might enjoy or your wife might enjoy things that I teach you or show you how to do when you pay me? And that I was happy to talk to him around sexual health and safety and things, but that it was obviously better if we didn't meet. That was partly because I regarded it as quite serious if somebody had a strong moral issue which they then overcame to pay for sex, because they are likely, if they do override that boundary, to blame you for it afterwards. So look what you made me do, evil woman. But equally, my concern for this young man was that I had a relationship several years ago, for several years, with somebody who, having had an absent father, had his father turn up when he was 12 years old, tell him that it was time he became a man, and his father then took him to a brothel. That was outright act of child abuse. But he was then exploited by a lot of older women pretty systematically. And in his 20s, even though he was involved in a very glamorous area of the media and had lots of women very interested in him, any time that he actually he performed sexually, he regarded it as it was something that cast him into a really profound depression that would last for days afterwards. Either because he was remembering the kind of circumstances, and because for him it really was a performance that he had to use to get by as a teenager. I also had a lot of experience of people telephoning for me for sort of paid premium rate calls, who went through acts where it clearly became obvious this was something that really had happened to them and had been severely damaging. But possibly because of male inhibitions about seeking help or therapy and it being regarded as a sort of feminine thing to do, they were instead endlessly recreating exactly the same thing on the telephone and paying me for something which was not going to bring them justice and was not going to bring them any type of moving forward. Trying to compete with porn performers and others seeking to emulate the concocted fantasy can make men and women feel inadequate. It contributes to a view of sex as a series of escalating bucket list experiences. There's a lot of ignorance about female anatomy and physiology and a lack of curiosity about risks of serious harm and injury among men exposed to porn. I'm sure that some of the people listening to this will have experienced that. Expressions of pain, discomfort and fear on the faces of porn performers are intentional and are used as a means of arousal. Lube and condoms are often discouraged on porn shoots involving heterosexual anal sex precisely for this reason. Porn frequently depicts violent fisting and the forced insertion of large objects, which can cause serious injury and death. Some drugs used recreationally during sex anesthetize users to the levels of the harm being inflicted on them during acts of sexualized violence. Some, like cocaine, can also impede ejaculation and drive men to more extreme acts as they attempt to resolve this. This was an issue I found puzzling in the trial of the man who killed Natalie Connolly, because it was claimed that she enjoyed pain, but she had consumed a very large quantity of a known anesthetic, cocaine, in the run-up to that. I've met some women who were aroused by pain, but in no circumstances would they have sought to lessen the impact of it on them. There's also the issue of that at the sentencing stage, when it couldn't be questioned, a lot of allegations were made about the fact that she had watched certain things online might have suggested that she had certain proclivities. I wasn't aware of any section on Pornhub that actually depicts the acts that caused her very serious internal injuries. These are some BDSM tropes in translation. One thing I find interesting, that a lot of the advocates of BDSM, when there is yet another incident or case involving somebody who has suffered serious injury or death, are always suggesting that there's some better training or that somebody hasn't attended the right event. But they won't actually defend or even stand up and say, yes, for example, somebody who liked pain would not anesthetize themselves. They don't stand up for things that they claim to believe when they're criticizing the outcomes of some of these cases. Here are some BDSM tropes in translation. The submissive is in control. What this actually means is, look what you made me do, you must have wanted it. Use your safe word. This is in the context of you need to please your master. Novice sought for training. Your sexuality needs molding by another. Pushing your boundaries. Your boundaries are a challenge to be overcome, not limits for you. We need to raise your pain threshold. This is a sanitization of the legitimation of increasing levels of violence. And subspace, which is a form of shutting down, and it's difficult to distinguish from the state of dissociation. And all of these happen in a context where there's no consideration of what we now understand about coercive control, or about how, if you were not very experienced, you might think that at some point you were going to reach some nirvana of pain, or also that you might feel that in order to compete with the person your supposedly more experienced master has been involved with, you need to overcome obvious things like when you are shaking uncontrollably. The competition between men over concocted, edited fantasy acts depicted in porn and the expectation that they should live up to them can be physically and psychologically damaging for men. They contribute to feelings of sexual inadequacy and excessive pressure to perform like a male porn performer, who is merely playing a role and whose performance is frequently enhanced by drugs. Men are as likely to feel pressured into receiving acts of anal penetration without their consent having been obtained as women are. Group sex encounters involving multiple men and a single or smaller number of women are often arranged to initiate newcomers into a group and bind them to the other members, whether as a social network or as part of a criminal enterprise. Pressure to prove oneself masculine in a group situation can override boundaries an individual might have observed outside the group. These were, in fact, the circumstances of the notorious rape case called DPP Morgan in 1975, when an RAF officer told 3 junior colleagues of his that his wife was kinky and would pretend to protest if they had sex with her. He himself wasn't prosecuted afterwards because that was the time when rape within marriage was still permitted. I had many occasions when these types of sort of binding things, they're a bit like hazing for initiates, happened. One very remarkable one in which 3 people proved that they came into the Stanley Milgram people who didn't turn on the electrodes because they actually left. But a lot of the time there would be men who were clearly not very, very willing going through this in order to become part of some kind of network. I think some of these pressures are also quite a serious issue, and also something where you're likely to be blamed afterwards for something that they did. Few boundaries remain in the clique-driven escalation of sexualized violence in porn and the imposition of norms taken from this on sex in real life. One of the remaining boundaries is sex involving children. Increasing numbers of younger British men between 18 and 26 years old are looking at child abuse images online and becoming online paedophiles after becoming desensitized through growing up on a staple diet of Pornhub and similar sites. The UK is already the 3rd biggest consumer of child abuse images online. It's very important that efforts to improve sex and relationship education for young people take place in the knowledge that these are the directions in which the competitive escalation of extreme practices in porn and the normalization of these practices outside porn are heading. I was communicated with very frequently when I worked in prostitution by men in their teens trying to get me to work with much younger female relatives or girlfriends of theirs. So it's not something that is a new phenomenon. It's another thing where the issue of boundaries is very important, because people who were likely to exploit children in these circumstances are easily capable of getting into all sorts of situations that would enable them to do so. Prude. How many times have you been called this? Women and men may feel pressurized to receive anal sex or acts of anal penetration, or to submit to acts of rough sex for fear of being labelled prudish. This label, prude, is not directed at dominant heterosexual or bisexual men for whom receiving anal penetration or rough sex would be an act of submission violating their self-perception, nor at gay or bisexual men who are top, nor at the directors of Hitachi, which withdrew a back massager from sale after finding out that women were buying this medical device because it is a very effective vibrator. Nor is it directed at women who have exited porn or prostitution, for whom every act was a performance they would not choose to reenact in their intimate life. There are a number of different psychological effects of exposure to sexualized violence. Post-traumatic stress disorder. This is stereotypically associated with combat veterans, and in a lot of mainstream newspapers, it still is. But in fact, rates of PTSD in women in prostitution are higher than they are for combat veterans, particularly if the women are involved in street prostitution. More generally, in England, the group most likely to screen positive for PTSD is women aged 16 to 24, 12.6% of the sample in mental health morbidities carried out by the NHS. Only in the ages 55 to 64 category are men in England more likely to screen positive for PTSD than women. These are other psychological effects of sexualized violence: depression, self-harm, substance misuse, dissociation, panic attacks. And a lot of these cases, what the sort of common outcome would be somebody saying, you suffered from depression and therefore these things happen to you, or that depression or these other diagnoses are inevitable, they're sort of predictive and things like this. But in a very large number of cases, and particularly with PTSD and also with borderline personality disorder, those diagnoses are the result of trauma. And I'm a great believer myself in trauma-focused therapeutic responses and the power, threat, meaning framework, which is in fact being introduced a lot in health services in the UK, where instead of asking, what is wrong with you, to somebody, you ask, what happened to you? Because it gives you better understanding rather than the label that a diagnosis is. This is something that I think is a big point about both BDSM and sort of rough sex things, which is that rough sex practices derived from BDSM and the escalation of porn-driven sexualized violence contribute to an inversion of the understandings of reward and sanction in real life. Receiving pain and violence during sex is seen as a reward for good behavior. The withholding of it is represented as a punishment for poor performance. Where there are financial rewards, even declining ones, for receiving pain, violence, or potentially hazardous body fluids, which is increasingly common, during sex, but poverty, lack of housing, unemployment, sexism, racism, and other forms of inequality persist if you exit porn and prostitution, this inversion of reward and sanction is likely to be amplified for you in society. This is one of many reasons why provision for women who have exited porn and prostitution, who have many transferable skills, needs to be improved. There need to be alternatives to performing in order to survive. Thank you.